So I think if everyone's happy to start, then we can go ahead and kind of formally open this exciting seminar. I can see we've still got a few more people trickling in, but hopefully we've got the majority of attendees are here now. So just to introduce myself then, and please do, I think the attendees are able to post things in the chat, right, as well? So attendees who are on the line, if you can't hear me, please do signal. But if I don't hear anything back, I'll assume that you can, and I'm broadcasting and you can hear me fine. So I wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Ilona Drewry, and I'm Head of International Engagement for Ocean Plastic Pollution, working at Defra for the UK government. Thank you very much for joining this exciting seminar, Breaking the Plastic Wave Across the Commonwealth. We're delighted to see so many participants from across the Commonwealth and beyond joining us to talk about this important report. So the world has gone through some extraordinarily challenging times in 2020, as we're all aware, and work has been reprioritised during this time to meet the demands of COVID-19. But COVID-19 has also provided a stark reminder of what happens when humanity's relationship with nature breaks down. And as we recover, we have an opportunity to protect and restore nature, which is why the UK has spearheaded and signed up to the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, committing to put nature and biodiversity on a road to recovery by 2030. And it remains essential that we continue to find moments like these to come together. So ocean plastic pollution has not gone away, sadly, and the UK, along with our co-chair Vanuatu and members of the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance, or COCOA, continue to work together to tackle the scourge of plastic pollution in our ocean. So today we will explore what we can learn from the Breaking the Plastic Wave report, a comprehensive assessment of pathways towards stopping ocean plastic pollution. As members of the COCOA, we have already committed to ambitious and concrete steps towards reducing ocean plastic pollution, and this report can and will inform us further and encourage sharing of knowledge and expertise. This session will allow us to consider how we can apply learning from the report and also provide an opportunity to discuss common themes that many countries have brought to our attention, some of which featured in some recent COCOA virtual coffee mornings that we held back in the summer. So before I hand over, I would just like to say a few words about the UK government's activities in addressing plastic pollution across the Commonwealth. For those who may not be familiar, the UK and Vanuatu established the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance, or COCOA, a few years ago to tackle marine plastic pollution by encouraging countries to take action. The COCOA brings together member states, businesses, NGOs from across the Commonwealth to commit to action on plastic, share best practice, leverage funding, and push for global action. And so to deliver that mandate, we ask members to commit to one or more of the following ambitions, which are to take steps to eliminate avoidable single-use plastic waste, ban the sale and manufacture of microbeads and rinse-off personal care products, and cut down on the use of single-use plastic carrier bags. We now have 34 members across the globe out of 54 Commonwealth states, which is really exciting and just goes to show what a high priority the issue has across the Commonwealth and beyond. As we all know, events earlier this year had to be postponed due to COVID, including our planned COCOA Action Group meeting and a Commonwealth Clean Ocean conference that I know many of you were invited to and we were really excited about holding back in March. So to ensure momentum is maintained on this important issue, we successfully brought our COCOA Action Group back together in the summer through a series of virtual coffee mornings, which I mentioned, and these provided a wonderful opportunity to have an informal chat and to gauge the level of enthusiasm for further initiatives this year, such as this webinar that we're hosting today. So in terms of my actual role today, I'm excited to be chairing the webinar and steering the conversation and discussion over the next 90 minutes. And thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to Common Seas who are co-hosting and our wonderful presenters coming up. So you'll all have a copy of the agenda already, but in brief, as you can see from the slide on the screen, we will hear from Joe Royal and Ben Jack, who are respectively Managing Director and Programme Director at Common Seas. We'll hear from Dr. Winnie Lau, who's a Senior Manager at Preventing Ocean Plastics at Pew, and John Virdin, Director of the Ocean and Control Policy Programme, the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. We have a pretty full agenda, and we'll do our best to keep within our timings. And I'm delighted to now hand over to Joe Royal, who is Managing Director at Common Seas.
Thank you very much. We work with governments, some of whom are represented here today, to create evidence-based mitigation strategies and then convene the right partners from across business, government and society to turn those strategies into practical on-the-ground solutions. And together we aim to quickly and significantly reduce the threat that plastic waste poses to our people, our communities and our environment. And Common Seas is delighted to be co-producing this event in collaboration with the UK government and with the government of Vanuatu. Today's discussion provides us with an opportunity to bring together and share insights from 3 amazing projects that we've been involved with this year. Each of these projects represents leading research and insights into the state of plastics in 2020, and most importantly, what we can do to solve this crisis in our lifetime. The projects were Breaking the Plastic Wave Report by Pew and the Duke University's incredible research of a review of government policies over the past 2 decades and what we can draw from these to create new policies going forward. And then as technical advisor for the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance Technical Assistance Facility, we had the opportunity to talk with 24 governments about how to tackle plastic pollution in their countries, given that we all have limited resources. The conversation I hope to facilitate today is how we can turn this new knowledge of 2020 into collective and effective action in 2021. To give you a quick example of how Common Seas has worked with governments, we recently supported the government of the Maldives, providing them with the evidence and the confidence to make a clear and ambitious commitment to phase out problematic plastics by 2023. And this kind of public commitment is really important because it brings together the right people. And now we're supporting businesses and society to ensure those policy commitments get turned into action on the ground. And the priority for us has always been to address the most polluting items first. And in the case of the Maldives, these are single-use plastic bottles used for drinks, personal care and household cleaning products. The range of solutions we're working to implement includes plastic alternative delivery systems, providing homes with financial support to install water filters, city refill stations, taxes on single-use plastic imports and deposit return schemes. So back to the job in hand, and today I'm here to encourage and facilitate a lively discussion in response to our 3 fantastic speakers, and I really need your help in doing this. So I'd like to ask you to pose questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and pose the questions, type the questions in as and when you think about them, so that we get them feeding in during the presentations. I'm hoping, I hear that we've got representatives from Cameroon, from the South Pacific, from Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone, Maldives, Gambia, so I'm really expecting some diverse and interesting questions for us to discuss. And you can vote up anyone else's questions you would like answered through clicking the thumbs up icon in the Q&A box. So thank you very much for your help and support in advance in our Q&A at the end of the speakers. So now I'm thrilled to introduce Winnie Lau, Senior Manager Preventing Ocean Plastics, Pew Charitable Trust. And Winnie played the pivotal role in bringing together the plastic wave report analysis to us. And I'm particularly looking forward to her presentation today that's going to draw out a few pieces of research and information that are most specifically of interest to the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance members. Thank you, Winnie.
Thank you so much, Jo, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be sharing with you today the findings of our recently released report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, and the accompanying paper in the journal Science. And as with any work of this magnitude, we had many partners. I want to acknowledge them, our implementing partner, Systemic, and our four thought partners, the University of Oxford, the University of Leeds, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Common Seas. This work also relied on the knowledge and expertise of our expert panel, who generously shared their time, who collectively represented experience across the whole plastics value chain and in geographies around the world. So when we started looking at this work over 2 years ago, we recognized that various strategies have been proposed about how we could solve the plastic pollution problem, centered around mainly around the five you see here on this slide. We also realized that the evidence around their effectiveness was lacking. So we set out to assess how each of them performed environmentally, economically, and socially for different plastic materials and under different geographies. And we also wanted to see how much each of them would cost and the investments required. So first off, we found that under a business as usual trajectory, plastic pollution will become unmanageable. Plastic generation will double in the next 20 years, which would result in 3 times more plastic going into the ocean each year by 2040. And that in turn would lead to the stock of plastic in the ocean being 4 times more than what it is already there today. The outlook is stark under the business as usual trajectory. In the past few years, many companies and governments have made commitments to reducing plastic pollution, and we mapped out what those current commitments could achieve. And as you can see, unfortunately, these current commitments only make about a 7% difference from what we project in 2040. We also modeled a number of single solution strategies that focus on one part of the plastics life cycle. Many technologies, such as mechanical recycling or chemical recycling, have been positioned as silver bullets that could be scaled up to solve the whole plastic pollution problem. However, our analysis showed we cannot recycle our way out of the problem. In fact, relying mainly on recycling would lead to 65% more plastic going into the ocean each year than what we have today. Similarly, we cannot collect and dispose or reduce our way out of the problem. So in short, there are no silver bullet solutions. With any of the single solution strategies, we saw that at best, we would be keeping at where we are today, the status quo. However, luckily, we also found that there was one strategy that could bend the plastic pollution curve with ambitious pre-consumer and post-consumer approaches. This is the system change scenario. It indicates that with what we know today, we can decrease the amount of plastic pollution going into the ocean in 2040 by over 80%. So what does plastic pollution look like by country income grouping? As previous research showed, more plastic pollution comes from middle and low income countries, and that is what we found as well. Middle and low-income countries contribute over 90% of the plastic pollution, despite consuming only about 60% of the plastic production. So what contributes to this disproportionate plastic pollution in middle and low-income countries? First, per capita waste generation is growing much faster in middle and low-income countries than in high-income countries. I do want to point out that per capita waste generation in high-income countries is much higher to begin with. Coupled with high population growth, total waste generation will be growing much faster in middle and low-income countries in the next 20 years. The second reason that there is more leakage in middle and low-income countries is the big gap in collection. About 2 billion people, mainly in middle and low-income countries, do not have collection services today. And that number is expected to grow to 4 billion people. To give you a sense of the scale of this collection gap, if we were to connect everyone to waste collection by 2040, we would have to connect about 500 people per day, every day between now and the next 20 years. So as a result of the collection gap, over 70% of the plastic waste generated in middle and low-income countries is not properly managed, compared with just 4% in high-income countries. There is one silver lining, and that is that the informal waste collection sector in middle and low-income countries contribute more to plastic waste that is collected for recycling. The waste pickers, in fact, contribute to 60% of the plastic waste that is collected for recycling globally today. So finding ways to improve their working conditions and pay will be important for solving the plastic pollution problem, as well as the social justice problem. So how can we decrease plastic waste going into the ocean and increase the amount of plastic recycled? So plastic waste is collected based on value, and currently the flexible monomaterials, these are the plastic carrier bags, the plastic films that our food is wrapped in, and then also the multi-layer materials. These are the sachets, the crisp bags. They do not have much recycling value. These types of plastics are harder to collect and sort, even for the informal sector, have less plastic value, and generally much more expensive, if not economically infeasible to recycle. And they make up the biggest proportion of the plastic leaked into the ocean today, at about 50%, and will continue at the same rate even under our best case system change scenario. Another area of concern our research highlighted is the amount of plastic waste that is openly burned in uncontrolled settings. It was by far the largest component of mismanaged waste, even under the best case scenario. So even though burned plastic is not ending up as plastic pollution in the environment, it is releasing greenhouse gas, as well as other harmful toxic chemicals and particulates into the air, soil, and water. This is an area that needs much more attention, or it can worsen other pollution problems or impact climate goals. And lastly, business as usual. Under business as usual, high-income country waste export to middle and low-income countries is expected to grow. This could have the unintended consequence in middle and low-income countries of importing unrecyclable plastic waste, or taking up domestic recycling capacity, which then can affect domestic recycling targets. However, despite all the challenges I just mentioned, the system change scenario looks to be a credible pathway getting towards zero plastic going into the ocean. Through ambitious reduction, substitution, recycling, and safe disposal, we can dramatically cut the amount of mismanaged waste from about 35% today of all waste generated to just 10% by 2040. Reduction is by far the largest lever to the system change pathway, at about 1/3 of the plastic projected in 2040 under business as usual, followed by substitution at about 17%, and then doubling recycling capacity from today would take 20% of the plastic waste managed, and then finally disposing of about 1/4 of the plastic waste. And then importantly, we find that the system change scenario is the most attractive pathway environmentally, economically, and socially, and also contributes to the achievement of other sustainable development goals. It will cost governments globally $70 billion less than business as usual, while dramatically cutting down on plastic pollution rates, reducing projected plastic-related greenhouse gas emissions, and creating more jobs. Now, I do want to be transparent about the waste management costs by income group. Managing plastic waste does incur costs, and there will be a slightly higher cost in middle and low-income countries under the best-case system change scenario. Currently, these waste management costs mainly fall to government. However, there are emerging policy schemes such as deposit return schemes and other extended producer responsibility policies that would enable cost sharing with industry and reduce the burden to governments, and at the same time, significantly reducing plastic pollution in the environment. When we look at all of the levers, reduce, recycle, dispose, and substitute, we found that reduction solutions will be the cheapest and in fact represent a net profit under the best case scenario. Substitution with alternative materials will be the most expensive without significant innovation. And recycling could be a net profit in middle and low income countries. However, if a price is put on carbon in the future, the costs may change. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, eliminating and reducing plastic will also be a substantial savings in greenhouse gas emissions over recycling, disposal, and substitution. Open burning of plastic waste is by far the highest greenhouse gas emissions solution we have. Now, in terms of innovation, there is a lot happening today in the reduction lever that could provide substantial cost savings and enable middle and low income countries to bypass the high waste trajectory of high income countries. These innovations include new refill and reuse systems. In fact, one of the leaders in this area is the company Algramo, which started in Chile and has now spread to high income countries. There are also opportunities for low packaging design and delivery systems without single-use plastics. These opportunities would allow middle and low-income countries to leapfrog to a cleaner, healthier, and more circular economy. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share our work with you. There's much more detail about the findings and the research in the report and in the science article in the links shown here on the slide. And I look forward to your questions and discussion later.
Thank you so much, Winnie. That was a really, fascinating presentation, and to kind of hear more about the levels of change that we can make by adopting different approaches to the way we address plastic pollution. I think I was really struck by one of the data points that you cited about the scale of waste collection. And, in that 500 people per day would need to be connected to waste collection services every day going forward, which is obviously a huge number and is clearly a priority. I am really pleased to now be handing over to John Virdin, who is Director of the Ocean and Control Policy Programme at Duke University, and he will talk us through some research that's been conducted on analysis of government responses over the last 20 years or so. Over to you, Dron.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And let me just come on there and say thank you for having me here, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's really a pleasure to join you all today. As some of the colleagues mentioned earlier, I'm going to share a little bit about the study that we just recently conducted that we completed in May, looking backwards over the last couple decades at how governments around the world have been responding to the plastic pollution problem. What policies have governments been introducing at the international level, at the national level, and particularly at the subnational level, at the local level, where so much of the effort has taken place. So just as Dr. Lau presented results of analysis looking forward into the future, trying to model and predict the outcome of different scenarios of interventions, we've done the opposite, and we've looked backwards over the last 2 decades to understand a little bit better about how governments have been responding to this, how we've been trying to solve this problem, and what we can learn to date from these efforts, what's worked and what hasn't. So those are the main questions that we've looked at, and we were hoping that at least as we go forward and as we try to tackle some of the challenges that Dr. Lau mentioned, this study might give us a little bit better sense of where we are right now, at least where governments are. And of course, we know that all stakeholders have a role to play in solving this global problem, but certainly governments have a critical role. And so we wanted to understand better how they're tackling it. So in order to do that, the first thing that we did, because there doesn't currently exist any type of global tracking mechanism or monitoring program for government policy responses, we've tried to put together what we call a plastics policy inventory, essentially a global database of all the laws and regulations that have been introduced over the last 20 years, explicitly aiming to tackle this problem, explicitly stating that they're trying to address leakage of plastics at some point in the life cycle of these products. And so to do that, we looked at international law databases. We mined all of the scientific and gray literature that we could find. We talked to experts, and we came up with this inventory that has roughly 300 laws and regulations introduced over the last 20 years. And we know it's not comprehensive or complete. We're trying to continue to add to it, and certainly welcome anything that we've missed. Please do send to us. But we feel like at the international level, it's based on everything that we've seen in the literature, based on what we know has been referred to. We feel like it's pretty complete. At the national level, we think it's reasonably indicative of what governments are doing at the national level to respond to this problem. And I think we have about 40 to 50% of the policies in our database that we've seen at least mentioned in, whether it's in news media or scientific articles or elsewhere. And then at the subnational level, we have to confess, it's just it's examples right now. We have about, say, 66, 67 policies at the international level over the last 20 years, about 150 at the national level, and then some 90 or so at the subnational level. These are just much harder to find, and we know it's not complete by any means, that level. But even still, it's interesting looking across all of these and starting to see the trends in government responses. We see national level policies being introduced in a range of contexts that you see in the map here around the world over the last 20 years. And at every single level, whether it's globally at the international level or regionally, nationally, subnationally, we've seen over the last 10 years a pretty significant increase in the number of laws and regulations introduced trying to address this problem in some ways. And we've just shown here the trend in national level policies. Of course, these are not necessarily caused by these corresponding international policies that we put on the chart, but we just wanted to illustrate these occurring at a similar time. And again, seeing really this clear trend across all of these different levels of policies. And when we started opening these up, we reviewed and analyzed all of these laws and regulations to see what tools were governments using to try to address plastic pollution. What were the instruments of choice? And most frequently at the national level and at the subnational level as well, for the examples we have, far and away, it's just outright bans of different types of plastics, particularly single-use plastics that are being targeted. You know, at least in the academic literature, scientific literature, we often see the debate about which is more effective: economic instruments, taxes, fees versus bans on pollutants. But clearly, from the inventory, the data we have, bans have been the tool of choice by governments at the national level. And this has really driven and much of the growth of policy responses over the last 10, 20 years has really been driven particularly by bans on plastic bags. It's very targeted laws and regulations being introduced around the world to address bans on plastic bags that have driven a lot of the growth in the policies that we have. And in the inventory that we've constructed, we found, as of mid 2019, at least 43 countries around the world have introduced some form of a ban or a tax or a fee on plastic bags. And so this is certainly a growing trend, at least in the policy responses that we've seen around the world. Interestingly, and I won't spend long on this, but I think it's worth noting that given the growing attention in recent years on microplastics, we're still not seeing that in our data in terms of government responses. We only found at the national level 9 policies with any kind of instrument trying to address microplastic pollution in some way. And these are pretty strictly a phenomenon of Europe and North America over the last 5 years, and largely related to monitoring, research, better understanding of the scale and scope of the microplastic pollution problem, compared to, say, macroplastics, single-use plastics, and much more specific, targeted, and varied policy responses that we see there. So this is still clearly, at least in the data that we have, a bit of a lag from as awareness, as the science on the role of microplastics in pollution and ocean and plastic pollution grows. We're starting to see, but not yet, a significant number of government responses to the problem. And we looked, of course, as you might expect, these policies all reflect specific contexts, where they're passed, where they're formulated and introduced. And we looked at trends in this. And one of the things, at least in the data that we have, and admitting that this is somewhat biased by English language databases and information, but a lot of the growth in the national level policies were driven not only by efforts to address plastic bags, but particularly efforts in sub-Saharan Africa, and then beyond in lower income countries. And 33 of the 43 national level policies that I mentioned occurred throughout the continent of Africa. Again, bans being more frequently used than taxes, economic tools to address the problem. And there's some speculation, hypotheses in the literature that we saw that, well, bans might be administratively less complex, lower cost to introduce, to monitor, to enforce compliance. And so it's somewhat intuitive that this might be an easier tool to introduce in different contexts to address the problem than, say, taxes and fees and the types of accounting systems that are required with those. One thing that, in looking at the diversity of responses across different geographies, that we just thought was interesting to note, we talk about the different contributions to this global problem from different countries around the world in terms of what we estimate being the mismanaged plastic waste entering the oceans from coastal areas. And we took a look at one of the key papers that's been recited often, the Jamback 2015 paper, where they estimated the top 20 countries that produce mismanaged plastic waste from coastal sources. And of those 20 countries, 7 had no national policy whatsoever to address plastic pollution specifically, at least in our inventory. And another 4 only had policies specifically targeted to bags. So that just was interesting to us that over half of these top 20 countries, these top 20 polluters, according to at least this study, we couldn't find evidence of any policy response at the national level to the problem, or if so, only targeted to plastic bags. Now, of course, I have to say that doesn't mean they don't have one. It just means we couldn't find it. And of course, just because a country has a policy response doesn't give you any indication of how well it's working or the effect on the problem. But in terms of where governments are formulating responses, introducing laws and regulations to try to address this problem, it suggested to us that there may still be some gaps in responses in where some of the biggest polluters are trying to address this problem, at least according to the models. Now, of course, as I mentioned, just because you have a law regulation on paper doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the effect that's actually having on the problem and on levels of pollution. And we really tried to see what is the state of the science on what is working and what isn't working from all of these policies, these laws and regulations. So we took a pretty deep dive into the scientific literature, gray literature reports, technical reports. We screened over 13,000 papers from a 20-year period to try to see what has been observed in terms of cause and effect between the cause of introducing a policy, a law, or regulation, and the effect on some type of plastic pollutant. We didn't find much, as you may suspect, and what we did find was almost exclusively focused on plastic bags again. And really, I would say about 6 to 8% of the policies that we know have been introduced actually have been studied in terms of their effects on plastic bag consumption or pollution. The studies that we found all looked at their short-term effects, or mostly looked at their short-term effects of these policies on bag consumption. They found pretty consistent reductions in consumptions. I mean, these varied, of course, from lower levels in the mid 20% to as high as 80, 90%, but pretty typically, there was a significant effect on reducing plastic bag consumption, regardless of whether it was a ban or a tax. Very rarely, or in no cases, did these eliminate the problem altogether. So they weren't solving it 100%, but there was a significant effect. Together, of course, with the caveat that there were unintended consequences observed in some cases. Bans in particular might shift the demand into other products that had consequences, whether it be plastic garbage bags instead of plastic carrier bags, or paper bags that come with their own impacts. And then, of course, in some senses, studies found that for the economic instruments, consumers might internalize these costs over time, and then the demand goes back to the previous levels. And so you might have to keep adjusting the fee rates to change behavior. But the key takeaway, I think, for us was the type of instrument that you choose, a tax, ban, was less important. There were consistent effects on consumption throughout the literature, but with some of these caveats about unintended consequences and how you design these. And then I'll close quickly just by noting that one of the last things that we tried to do is, in going through all of the scientific literature, was just to say very quickly, are there consistent recommendations that scientists have been making for the design of new policies? And there were, and we've highlighted a few of these, but the one I just want to mention in closing is that very consistently throughout all of the literature, scientists recommended the efficacy, the impact of using information alongside some of the bans, taxes, more comprehensive policies, educating public, conducting awareness campaigns, help people better understand the purpose behind the policy, what the intention was, how it worked, and typically increase the effectiveness of the policies. At the same time, these were very rarely in our data combined with these policies. So the scientists have consistently recommended using more information efforts, campaigns, awareness, education alongside these other types of policy instruments. But we didn't see that happening yet in a large portion of the policies that we saw. So that was clearly for design going forward of policies, a consistent recommendation from the science, and then we have a number of others there as well. So I'll close with that, and thank you all again, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. That was really fascinating to hear. I mean, it's encouraging, obviously, to see that more and more countries are adopting plastic policies, and to hear some insights into sort of where some of the gaps are and maybe what might be working. I was particularly struck by the slide that overlaid Jenna Jambek's research on the top 20 most polluting countries, with that quite stark comparison of the limited evidence of plastic pollution policies, and there's clearly some gaps there, and much work to be done on addressing the issue. And it's important for us as representatives from across the Commonwealth to take these things on board as we develop our individual and collective responses to plastic pollution. So before I hand over to our third and final presentation from Ben Jack, who is Programme Director at Common Seas, I just wanted to say a few words of scene setting. So Ben is going to be drawing out some of the high-level themes that came out of scoping work from our Commonwealth Clean Ocean Technical Assistance Facility, or COCOA TAF. So this work is funded by the UK government, and the COCOA TAF itself aims to support ODA eligible COCOA members to implement their commitments under the COCOA, so the 3 ambitions that I sketched out at the start of the seminar. And COCOA TAF programming has been made up of 2 phases so far. So phase 1 started last year, and DAI Europe, in partnership with Common Seas, delivered the scoping phase of the TAF, developing terms of reference for projects in tandem with governments to deliver COCOA commitments. The phase 1 sort of concluded earlier this year with 30 TORs, or terms of reference, designed across 16 countries, or 17 if we also bring in the Pacific region one. The start of phase 2, which aims to actually deliver the scope within the TORs, has unfortunately been delayed due to COVID-19. And we're currently exploring options to deliver phase 2, and we'll update partners and those involved in due course. So through scoping work and collaboration with countries, intense collaboration to sort of develop the TORs in phase 1, key themes emerged, which Ben will consider in more detail. And these themes provide a basis for us to consider, needs and opportunities for countries right across the Commonwealth, including those that are not, are non-ODA eligible as well as ODA eligible, and help us to make links with the priorities that we have heard highlighted already by Winnie and John. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ben.
Great, thanks so much, Ilona, and thanks to everybody else as well for joining us today. It's great to be with you. Well, firstly, just to say it was hugely exciting for Common Seas, alongside colleagues at DAI, to be part of this work to support the efforts of the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance. And it's also great just to see a couple of the DAI team members joining. I think Kathy and Chris are on the line, who did so much work to support this. So I'm really glad you could be here with us today. And the map you're seeing, or rather the red on the map, sort of highlights this journey of discussions that we've been on around 24 different eligible Commonwealth countries. Discussions that spanned a huge range of stakeholders, were supported by a range of global experts. So I also can see you joining us today. So thanks for joining us and thanks for your efforts. And obviously working across really diverse cultures and country contexts. But you know, the real common commitment around addressing this terrible issue of plastic waste and pollution. Across that, it's also been a great privilege to see the amount of knowledge that exists within the Commonwealth network, as well as also really laying bare and giving a very vivid sense of the breadth of the challenges faced. So I suppose it's given us a lot that we could talk about today, but over the next 10 minutes, I just wanted to use a little bit of time to try and draw out perhaps just 4 themes that really sort of came through from our discussions. And it feels like if we could kind of collectively get behind these themes, then we'd be making really important inroads into addressing the problem. So what are these themes? Well, the first thing we heard is, okay, we're all constrained by limited resources, but how do we go about really understanding the problem to build that sufficient evidence that's needed to design and evaluate an effective national response? Secondly, we talked a lot about the need to adapt and design interventions so they meet local needs and local conditions. The third thing was really, how do we develop and bring to market the new systems and the new materials that can actually match the government ambition to phase out single-use plastic? And finally, I think that question around, you know, how do we continue to learn together to collectively overcome challenges, to address common needs and share best practices? So I'm going to just sort of do a bit of a deep dive into each of these themes. And the first one is thinking about how do we build the knowledge base to support effective mitigation action. I think it goes without saying that all of the governments we spoke to recognise the urgency of acting and recognise the severity of the problem. And it was interesting that, you know, so many times plastic was not just framed as an ocean problem, it was framed as a real dire threat to health, a threat to economies, a threat to livelihoods, and of course it affects climate, an impact on climate change as well. But despite that recognition, we also frequently heard, you know, if we can't measure it, then we can't manage it. And lots of kind of follow-up questions thinking about, okay, well, if I want to create an effective national strategy, how do I do that if I don't have that rooting in a clear understanding of what the plastic waste streams are and what are the points of leakage within my economy? And equally, okay, I want to think about embedding producer pays principles, but how do I go about designing an EPR if I don't really know the volumes of materials coming from different sources onto the market? So whilst there's a strong kind of urge to act, the challenges of actually making it happen at the pace required is really kind of difficult. You know, for example, I think one government we spoke to, they estimated that today about 80% of their plastic was mismanaged, but they lack that fundamental baseline data to really think about an evidence-based response to that. And of course, the people we're talking to, we're working across often many sort of complex social and environmental agendas, and we also find that they're navigating very complex internal relationships across the many departments and individuals that are responsible for that kind of life cycle of plastic, whether it be kind of managing the waste at one end or responsible for creating a mitigation response at the other. And so I think some of those kind of constraints go a long way to explain some of the things that John was talking about. How, like, if we look back at the last 20 years, you can see that we have a rather piecemeal response, perhaps kind of reaching for the ban, reaching for the single item interventions, rather than really thinking about what Winnie's putting forward, and we all know we need to deliver, which is this system-wide system change response. So I think going forward within this theme, there are opportunities for us to further deliver the practical tools and guidance that are needed to build that evidence, crucially to build it in a timely manner. Obviously, we need to avoid paralysis by analysis, But beyond the sort of the data, also supporting the facilitation, so bringing together people around the plastics circular network, and to ensure that we embed a really holistic approach within a country's response. So the next theme I want to talk about is really about how do we ensure that policies are responsive to local needs. And of course, you know, everyone knows we need to do this. And as Winnie raised earlier, there are a number of important differences, both in terms of the problem and the solution, when you look at sort of global north versus global south economies. But what John's been saying and what the policy inventory really shows us is that actually the sort of literature at the moment is kind of dominated by case studies of policies that have been enacted in places like Europe and North America. And so a lot of the conversations we had were thinking about how we need to make sure we avoid sort of copying and pasting policies. So how do we adapt them into fundamentally different markets? I think particularly we'd like to highlight within this, talking about deposit return schemes. So again, well established globally, probably 45, 50 examples worldwide. We know they can be very effective, probably 98% reduction in plastics if we really kind of get everything lined up to deliver it. But the schemes are only effective if they're supported by really carefully considered financial models, obviously the right level of technology, the right level of infrastructure that's needed to support collection, and of course, the logistical challenge sometimes of getting those materials to an end market. So it's been really interesting to hear across a range of cocoa nations how DRS is being considered in different contexts. So how does DRS work in a country perhaps where the baseline in terms of waste collection and recycling is far lower? How does it work when actually the end market for those materials is a long way away, or perhaps the total volume of materials on the market is simply a lot lower? So it's a really interesting considerations there. I think another good one to point out, and probably another obvious one to mention, of course, is how do we improve waste management and particularly waste collection services? And I mean, going back to the Breaking the Plastic Wave report, you know, one of the most astonishing findings for me personally was that today more plastic is collected for recycling by hand, remembering that this is often some of the most marginalized members of our kind of global community doing this, than all of the mechanized collection services put together. But of course, that's sort of common knowledge in many ways to a number of the governments that we've been speaking to about this. And they really recognize the need to manage the social costs of mismanaged plastics as much as the environmental costs. And it's been really interesting to see some of the efforts that are going into there to think about sort of legal recognition, legal protection, access to technology, safer working conditions for waste workers. Perhaps just before I move on to the third theme, just want to sort of step back a little bit and think about perhaps a more higher level, more fundamental change or difference in the approach that we need to take. And that's really the need for low and middle income countries to forge a different path and to avoid all the, frankly, the terrible mistakes that we've made in global north in terms of how we manage this problem. I mean, Winnie's research showed that, you know, today the per capita waste generation in a lot of the countries we're talking about is, you know, about a quarter of high income countries. And if you go to the marketplace, there's still kind of many goods and services that are delivered without sort of copious volumes of single-use plastic. But, you know, that picture is changing very fast. And already we know that the sort of development of the downstream waste management systems can't keep pace with that plastic growth. And this really demonstrates the importance of, you know, not getting locked into this global north pattern of generating huge volumes of plastic waste that simply can't be managed, and we have to send abroad or bury or burn. It's a system that's clearly broken. And so I think going forward, as well as thinking about how do we adapt policies today to make sure they're in tune with local livelihoods and infrastructure and culture and behaviors, wouldn't it be also great if we could think about shaping a blueprint for innovation that would help some of the cocoa countries to leapfrog to a circular economy to plastic and avoid sort of this high waste generation scenario. So moving on now to the third theme, which was all about, you know, how do we develop locally appropriate systems and materials that will enable us to effectively design out single-use plastics. And perhaps just again touching back on what Winnie was saying, the system change scenario, the scenario that can get us that over 80% reduction in ocean plastic compared to business as usual, it shows that there's that big reduced lever that we need to be pulling. And not only is that really effective in terms of ocean plastic pollution, but it's also associated with some of the, well, by far the biggest improvements in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions as well. And so in terms of our conversations, you know, across these different countries, it's been really exciting to see that actually cocoa nations are putting forward, I think, arguably the most ambitious policies to turn off the plastic tap anywhere in the world. But equally, we saw that alongside that, the ambition to phase out single-use plastics is not necessarily always matched by the availability of the systems and appropriate materials that can replace it, and that poses a number of serious risks. I mean, the sort of ubiquitous mono-material flexible plastics that Winnie highlighted in her presentation, they came up a lot in the discussions that we had, particularly things like water bags, often sort of sold by street vendors at transport hubs within markets to provide potable water on the go, but are then often littered. Usually there's not sort of on-street infrastructure to capture it, and then they can block drains and cause health concerns. But of course, it's very hard to find an economically viable alternative to that material, and it's impossible to, well, economically impossible really to collect this stuff at scale, because it's, you know, often very contaminated. It's a lightweight material that no one really wants to pick up, has very little value. In other cases, there were a number of the governments that we spoke to had put in quite far-reaching single-use plastic bans, but of course this opens up the market for a proliferation of new materials that are coming on, particularly things like different biodegradable materials. And of course, for any material introduced, the end of life management considerations need to be really carefully thought through to make sure we're not replacing one pressure on the environment for another. So there are a few knotty problems, and I think going forward, collectively, it'd be really good for us to look at them, prioritizing the investment and the policies that will incentivize systems to design out the waste altogether, but then also ensuring that any substitute materials are regenerative and restorative in their impacts, and where the kind of enforcement needs and the end of life waste management needs are really considered alongside local capacity in the current local systems. And within all of this, bringing along the key stakeholders, so making sure that both businesses and the consumer are with us, so they know their role and they know how to respond. So to close, I guess the fourth theme is about how do we move forward together. And across all of the discussions we've had, it's been really heartening and hugely exciting to hear the appetite for knowledge sharing, for multilateral cooperation, for collective action. And you know, this really seemed to embody the values of the Commonwealth Charter. And it feels like there are lots of opportunities for us to build on this appetite, and also to build on a lot of the great resources that are there already in the shape of things like the Commonwealth Portal, for example, but to strengthen some of these opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and the development of common tools to address these common problems. You know, and I finished this work with a real exciting sense of how you can imagine a community of practice emerging across the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance that could deliver so much of the cooperation and commitment and ambition that we're going to need if we're going to deliver, you know, the system change scenario that the work of Pew so clearly lays out we need to. And of course, as a hugely diverse global network representing, you know, just about every region, income group, country type globally, what we demonstrate within the Commonwealth Clean Ocean Alliance has global resonance and value in our efforts to break the plastic wave. So I think I'll leave it there, and really look forward to any questions and discussion afterward. But I guess just before I do, just want to say a big thanks, not least because so many people are joined us today. A big thanks to all the people who gave their time and support for this work, and thanks also for the opportunity to present your work today as well.
Thanks, Ben. That was great to have a synthesis of all of the hard work and efforts, as you said, from multiple people across the world in drawing together that learning from the cocoa TAF. And I think you know, drawing out those themes and aiming to synthesize them is really important, because it does help us, you know, make links and sort of including to reports such as the findings that we're hearing about, the Breaking the Plastic Wave today, and the Duke University research. And really wonderful to hear your assessment that COCOA members are paving the way with ambitious action on, you know, plastic pollution and turning off the plastic tap. I'm delighted to say that the panelists kind of speaking to you this time is drawing to a close. I mean, it's been fascinating, but it's always nice to be on a seminar when you can ask questions and get involved and hear more about areas that you're interested in. And so now is that time.